And now, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker for today, Obenewa Amponsah. The Institute of Nonprofit Practice launched their inaugural Black Leadership Institute this year, of which I'm a proud member of the first cohort. And they pulled none other than Obenewa as the managing director. In addition to many other roles, she has served as the CEO of the Steve Biko Foundation, Executive Director of the Harvard University Center for African Studies, Senior Consultant with Good Works International. She is currently a Senior Fellow with the Atlantic Institute at Oxford University and an alumna of the Atlantic Fellowship for Racial Equity. And if that's not enough, she is also pursuing her doctorate degree. Her accolades are endless. Yet, it is her guiding ethos that we pulled upon today when we extended the invitation. That collectively, individuals, teams, and communities have the resources necessary to develop and achieve a vision that produces better outcomes for all. She knows deeply the power of imagination and new perspectives to unlock potential. And she is here today to ignite the dream of economic justice with us. Help me give a warm Rhode Island welcome to Obenewa.
Good morning, good morning, good morning, good morning. It is good to see you all. Now guys, I grew up in the Black church. So what that means is like when I say something, I need you to say something back. Good morning, good morning, good morning, good morning. Good morning. Much better. You all are quick learners. We're going to get a lot done today. Let me first start off by acknowledging Wayona and her leadership. I have the good pleasure of working with her, Shondell, at the Mary Harrison, as well at the Institute of Nonprofit Practice. We are also joined by some of our colleagues from INP. Wave your hands, let the people see you. We're joined by Lauren Williams, Alec O'Brien, and Audrey Dillis. While INP is very much a national organization, we're also very much locally rooted in local communities, and Providence is one of the places that we've been the longest, and where we have developed just that, a sense of community that helps to support, guide, and nurture leaders at all stages of their career. Now, let me just also confess, I am super happy to be here today. For one reason, I'm avoiding my trainer. Did you guys see that I struggled a little bit up the stairs? Yeah, let's just say this gave me a good reason to flee the gym this morning. But I'm also really excited to be here because Rhode Island is such an interesting place. You know, often when people talk about Rhode Island, they talk about it as a small place, right? But I don't think they realize that it's also a dynamic place where many interesting things have happened over the years. I was also excited to be invited to speak here today because the theme of the conference alone, igniting the dream of economic progress in Rhode Island. It's not often that the hard stuff of economics is paired with the soft skill of dreaming. But it's my view that it's in these unusual pairings where new ideas and new realities are born. I was also happy to be here and to come to Providence today, because guys, I like fashion. And you all are a good looking audience. But also two of my favorites are from Rhode Island. Viola Davis, of course, one of the greatest actresses of a generation, is from Rhode Island. And then a lesser known fact, anyone familiar with Andre Leontelli? He passed away recently. One of my favorite fashionistas, also studied at Brown University. And these are really just two of the cultural producers that have been shaped by this very special place. Not only has the state produced generations of artistic talent, but Rhode Island has been a protagonist in many of the United States' most salient policy issues, from its founding on religious freedom to the early, although unenforced, prohibition of slavery. In tracing the history of Rhode Island, we can trace many aspects of the nation's story, including its contradictions and contestations. Perhaps one of the starkest contradictions is that Rhode Island is home to the gorgeous mansions of the Gilded Age. structures that testify to the prosperity, for some, of America's industrial age. But this is a somewhat ironic characterization, given that throughout its history, Newport has largely been a working and middle-class city. In fact, today, according to the Newport Historical Society, the City by the Sea, as it's named, has the largest number of low-income housing units in the state. And this is really the issue that brings us here today, and one that I'd like to spend my time with you exploring. Economic inequality. I mean, Alan did his job and made his real manner, but also to talk about what are we going to do about it. But let me also acknowledge that in some ways I'm preaching to the proverbial choir. There are many places you could have been today on a rainy Friday morning, guys. I mean, this was commitment to come out in the rain, right? But you chose to be here. Your presence alone is an indicator of your commitment to changing the status quo. It's an indicator that you believe in the promise and the potential of dreams. If you didn't believe in the possibility of economic change, you would have gotten up extra early this morning, put on your super cute outfit, and made your way down to the Marriott, but you did. And for that, we celebrate and we appreciate you. The question then isn't whether we believe that economic inequality, for all of the reasons we've heard this morning, is a relevant and necessary issue to address. The question is whether our dream for economic progress is big enough. And if there's one thing you take away from my remarks today, it would be to dream bigger. Dream bigger. I began to ask myself what my dream for justice and equity was back in my student days at Boston University. Do we have any other BU grads here? Woo! Okay, go Terriers. We love to see it. I was an intern in what billed itself as an international human rights organization, although a small fledgling one. As one of the interns, I think I made up about 25% of the staff. So I remember drafting a proposal one day and sitting with my boss as he reviewed it. And when he came across the word eradicate, he crossed it out, saying that he hated that word. It made it sound as if we were exterminators talking about termites. Part of me, the part of me that was heading to her junior year of college and needed that meager paycheck, laughed at my boss's joke. Because, I saw a career-limiting move when I recognized one, right? But the rest of me was bewildered. I was bewildered, so much so that I broke out my thesaurus. And if you remember, I'm at that point where I think technically speaking, I'm getting maybe a little bit to middle age, yeah? And so many of you will know the thesaurus as that very convenient keyword function, Shift F7, it pops up. Who here remembers when the thesaurus was the size of a small child? Like you had to go get that, like when you were going to look at the thesaurus, you were committed to the cause. And on that day, I was committed to the cause. I went to look at what the word eradicate, what other substitutes were. And as I suspected, eradicate, which means to destroy completely or put an end to, the synonyms were to expunge, eliminate, and to my boss's point, exterminate. But rather than going with any of these terms, it was deemed that the more appropriate word choice was alleviate, which means to make suffering or a problem less severe. And this exchange made me begin to ask a fundamental question. As people concerned with justice and equity, what is our goal? Is it simply to minimize suffering, or is it to fundamentally alter the contradictions that are causing that suffering? Think about it. When people are sick, what do we say to them? Feel better. Get well soon. We don't say, I hope you feel less sick tomorrow. And if you do, you might just be a terrible person. This is a non-judgmental space, though. In the same vein, when you go to feed your loved ones, at the end of the meal, you don't say, are you less hungry? You say, are you full? When we speak to communities that have been marginalized and excluded, and we ask them what they want, they don't say they want to be less excluded, they want to be included. Not only to have a seat at the table, but to shape the table, what goes on at the table, the conversations at the table. True inclusion. Yet, when it comes to poverty, we seem to be conditioned to settle, to pursue alleviation instead of eradication. There seems to be a general sentiment that poverty is just one of those things we must live with. In fact, if like me, as I said, I grew up as a church girl, shout out to Beyonce, anyone recognize those lyrics? If you heard, and yes, I will find a way to bring Beyonce into everything. I'm not on her staff yet, but if somebody knows somebody, oh yeah. But if you were in church like me, you might have heard the scripture quoted often, the poor will always be with us.
Well,
But I've wondered if the poor will always be with us because of some cosmic inevitability or because of our willingness to change our priorities.
amen.
I like that. Next one. Let me also pause here and say that my comments are by no means meant to diminish the many years of work and commitment that so many people over the years have contributed to pursuing economic justice, both in this room and without. Progress has been made, and the data that has been shared here this morning suggests that we need to do more, and we need to do it urgently. Some may hear me and think, we're doing the best we can. We need to be realistic. Change doesn't happen overnight. And this is in many ways true. We live and work within systems and structures that sometimes seem immovable and intractable. Change can seem impossible, or that it'll take 10 lifetimes, or to the data that was just presented, 500 years. The other reality, though, is that daily we are surrounded by and utilize things that were once deemed impossible. From flying to the internet to digital banking, things that 120, let alone 30 and 20 years ago seemed to be the stuff of sci-fi are now our norms. And this is the case socially as well. It is not lost to me that as a Black woman who is a child of immigrants, 70 years ago, I couldn't have voted in this country. I wouldn't be standing at this podium. In fact, it wouldn't be legal in many places in the country for me to address an audience. This mixed race audience wouldn't even have been legal. There has been change and there has been progress, and there can be more as long as we prioritize it. So many of the things that we take for granted as normal and necessary parts of our lives now have not always existed. A few of them were named this morning, from the 40-hour work week to maternity leave to child labor laws. The creation of all of these things that are now norms were policy decisions. They came into being to address the needs of the times and to ensure the well-being of people. This is not to say that they were perfect and they don't need to be expanded, but they exist because choices were made, and we can continually make choices to improve them. As community members, leaders, and policymakers, the fundamental question we must ask ourselves is whether the current economic policies are adequately addressing the needs of communities. From what has been shared this morning, the answer is an unequivocal no. As rates of childhood poverty rise, we continue to see that the face of poverty is gendered and racialized. The temptation may be to lament that this is the way it's always been, and to work within the same policy frameworks and constraints of our current context, to take a gradualist approach. But I would argue that rather than settling or going slowly or monitoring step-by-step progress, I would argue that in the words of Thomas Sankara, we must dare to invent the future. Does anyone by any chance know who Thomas Sankara is? As was shared, I have a background in African studies, so you're always going to get a pinch of that. But Sankara was the former president of Burkina Faso, who was assassinated in 1987. He only spent 4 years in office before he was killed, and like most legacies, Sankara's is not a simple one by any stretch of the imagination. He was an imperfect leader governing in imperfect circumstances. Can anybody relate to that? Imperfect leaders, imperfect circumstances. Sankara led Burkina Faso, a small country in West Africa. And when he came to office in 1983, his country, which was still known by its colonial name of Upper Volta, was the poorest nation in the world. Please hear me, not one of the poorest, not among the poorest, it was the poorest. You know, when you look at the UNDP ratings, like it was at the very bottom, consistently. And please note that this is not the perfect analogy. Today, Burkina Faso continues to face economic, environmental, and political challenges, as do many places in the world. But the change they managed to facilitate in 4 short years was nothing short of extraordinary. Sankara was a visionary who not only advocated for gender equity, he planted 10 million trees to address climate change long before it was common practice. Within weeks, his government vaccinated 2.5 million children. We've had recent experiences of what it takes to get folks vaccinated. We know it's not easy, and this was in a time before the internet, before cell phones, landlines weren't in every home. I mean, this was a get out the vaccine effort, or they called upon what I like to refer to as a homegirl hotline, right? This was community coming together to make it happen. But perhaps the most impressive thing about Sankar's presidency, among many other impressive things, is that when he entered office in 1983, the national literacy rate was 13%. 13 out of 100 people were able to read. In a room this size, that would be about 39 of us who have the gift of literacy. 4 years later, the literacy rate was 73%. That part. Now, if you're like me, you're probably wondering how the poorest country in the world managed to achieve all of that and increase its GDP so it no longer held that dubious distinction. How did Sankara manage to lead so much change in such a short period of time? I would argue that there are three key things that we can learn from his example that enable the country to make such rapid progress, and that if we were to adopt them, they would enable us to fundamentally shift how we address poverty. These are less policy propositions because the truth is, you all have done the work. You know the answer. We've seen what works, what doesn't work. There are a million policy propositions out there for us to pick from at this time. But these 3 C's, as I call them, speak more to our mindset and the way in which we do this work. And I think the number one thing that is required if we're going to facilitate significant change in a short period of time is a compelling vision. The first thing Sankara did when he got into office was to call together a group of people to change the name of the country. At that point, it was still referred to by its colonial French name, Upper Volta, which indicated that, it was by the top of the Volta River, right? It was less an identity and more, GPS for back then, right? Instead, Sankara came through and renamed it Burkina Faso, which in local languages means the land of upright people, the land of incorruptible people. And in so doing, he put forward a compelling vision of self-reliance, of agency and identity, one that was shaped and co-created by the people around him. If we go back to my earlier analogy, most of us don't want to go to a dinner party where the host says, you'll leave less hungry. We want to go to a dinner party that is abundant, that is generous, and where we are challenged and engaged by our hosts. The second C, after we develop and articulate this compelling vision, is collaboration. The truth is we can't, but we also don't have to do it alone. Fulfilling a new vision will take new types of alliances. Often it's easier and more intuitive to partner with people and organizations who hold the same views and perspectives. But an expansive vision will require expansive relationships. The work ahead of us requires that we begin to build partnerships with some of the unusual suspects who have the same goals, but who may have different perspectives, experiences, zip codes, and approaches. And again, to achieve remarkable change in 4 years, there was not one segment of society that Sankara did not engage, from the illiterate market woman and informal traders to the captain of their very small industry to religious leaders. Everyone had a seat at the table. And then the last thing we must do is to calculate the cost. Now, typically when we talk about policy, we talk about how much implementation will cost. I'm suggesting that we calculate a different type of cost, that we calculate the cost of not doing it. When we get tired, when the coalition villain wears on us, and the temptation to revert to the status quo becomes overwhelming, we must think about the cost of not pursuing the expansive vision. What will be lost if we fail to realize the dream of economic justice? And when we have calculated the cost and remembered it is much too high a price to pay, that the Viola Davises, the Andre Leon Tallies require that we do something different. We must also remember that as leaders, as policymakers, as community members, we can go beyond responding to the status quo. We can remember instead that we must dare to invent the future. Thank you.
Wow. This moment I wish I wasn't out on queue and another organization was hosting because I needed to sit down and take all that. Thank you, Obenewa. Collective vision, collaboration, calculating the cost. We have our action steps laid out for us. And I think we can do it with the people in this room and outside this